I thought I would bring everyone up to date as to what's going on with our resident Sandhill Crane nest. It's only the middle of April, but already there's been quite a bit of drama going on. But before I divulge some rather bizarre occurrences over the past few days, I thought I'd take a stroll down memory lane, as I have been studying this particular pair of cranes for 8 seasons now. Every year certainly has its share of drama. Here's a summary of the history of the nest from my observations. In 2015, 2 eggs were laid, but only 1 hatched. This colt survived for only a few days before it unfortunately disappeared. In 2016, both colts hatched, but by the end of May, both colts had disappeared once again. In 2017, there were 2 colts again, but within a few weeks they were gone. We had severe flooding that year. By the way, that year's hatch video has drawn over 3 million views worldwide. In 2018, if you can believe things got worse, well, they did. Their initial nest was abandoned after a heavy snowstorm. They rebuilt on the edge of a pond, and literally just a day before they were due to hatch, they lost both eggs to predation. A drone video here shows only a few fragments of the eggs remained. In 2019, just as the eggs were hatching, it appeared that 1 egg rolled off of the nest into the water. Only 1 egg hatched. The last date I was able to see this colt was June 3rd, and then it was no longer seen again. How about some good news? 2020 was the year. Not only did both colts hatch, but they were seen in the fall of that year flying with their parents, and I assume that they migrated south together. Finally, success, and it was with both colts. In 2021, last year, was an interesting year as there was no spring floods and drought conditions persisted throughout the spring and the summer. The water level in the marsh was the lowest I've ever seen it. Both eggs hatched, and 1 colt was successfully raised. It was last seen in September of 2021. In a nutshell, the survival rate of the colts through the years has not been very good. As is quite often the case with Sandhill Crane nests, predation and floods are the 2 main culprits in nest failure. And that brings us to this year. It's the middle of April and the cranes have been on the nest for a few weeks. An interesting side note to this year's crane's nest is that it is located within 30 feet of a Canada goose nest. The geese built on top of a muskrat den, while the cranes built on the edge of the pond. We weren't sure how this was going to play out, but it appeared that the cranes were tolerant of the goose nest. Both the cranes and the geese have had a rough spring so far. April came in like a lion and has stayed that way. The majority of the days have been way below normal, and the first 18 days of this month have seen snow falling on 10 of them. It's also been very windy with very little sun. This past week has been a doozy weather-wise. A huge weather system headed into the Midwest on Tuesday with warm temperatures here and a blizzard in the Dakotas. Tuesday night brought severe thunderstorms and even a few tornadoes to southern Minnesota. Wednesday was the transition day. The weather was warm in the morning, but by evening temperatures dropped to just above freezing, and the rain showers turned to snow showers. Both Joe and I were away for most of Wednesday, but I got a text message that the goose nest had been abandoned. Sure enough, when we drove by the nest Wednesday evening, the Sandhill Crane nest was occupied, but the goose nest was empty. What caused the nest to be abandoned? Was it from the bad storms? Predation? It looked like there were still some eggs in the nest. Then came Thursday. Although we only received 0.64 of an inch of rain, water was rising rapidly on the Root River. As soon as I saw this, I made a beeline over to the Sandhill Crane nest. Sure enough, the water was rising in the ponds adjacent to the river, including at the nest site. Mom was frantically trying to pull up as many reeds as she could to raise the level of the nest. Her mate was nowhere to be seen, and for the hour or so that I spent watching her, she never incubated the eggs. This was with 40-mile-an-hour winds, cloudy skies, and temperatures barely above freezing. I left the site with her gathering reeds while the nest was unattended and water levels were still rising. It was really hard to watch. On Friday morning, I assumed the worst but decided to check on the nest site. I arrived with her on the nest incubating the eggs with the water level very close to the top of the nest. She then started once again gathering reeds. Just a mile upstream, the gauge indicated that the river had crested and it appeared the water was not rising any further in the pond. This didn't stop her, however, from working on the nest. Numerous times she was calling for her mate, but he did not appear. And then things started to get weird. The Canada goose that had abandoned the nest 2 days ago was back on her nest. She was sitting kind of funny on the nest and some of her eggs were not under her. It was then that I realized that she had been injured. Her neck was missing feathers and the left side of her head was mangled. She couldn't see out of her left eye as far as I could tell, and it is probably why she hadn't realized her eggs were not completely under her. I felt so bad for her. Evidently, a predator must have attacked her on the nest the night of the storms. It appeared that she successfully had defended the nest to some degree since the eggs were still there. Unfortunately, those eggs were left out too long in the cold to be viable. And then things got weirder. A beaver appeared in the marsh. Out of all the years that I have been at the nest site, I have never once seen a beaver. There are muskrats there all the time, and occasionally a river otter, but this was a first. It was pretty much minding its own business, swimming around and then resting on some reeds while preening and occasionally munching on them. Then, things got even weirder. The Sandhill Crane flew over to the goose nest and chased off the goose. It then started to pick up pieces of her nest, flinging it around, and then started to move the eggs. She seemed to be turning the eggs. The male goose then came flying into the marsh, frantically trying to lure the crane away from the goose nest. Eventually, the crane went back to her nest and began again to pull more reeds toward the nest and leaving the eggs unattended the whole time I was there, which was well over an hour once again. I left after that incident. Does this story get crazier? You bet. Besides myself, there were others who were monitoring the nest. I was texted shortly after I left that the beaver swam over to the goose's nest and started digging under the nest. It moved the eggs out of the way while it was digging. What a crazy day. I returned in the afternoon to find both sandhill cranes tending to the nest, still moving more reeds over to it. The water was starting to recede, but they weren't taking any chances. Where the heck was its mate while the nest was in serious jeopardy? I have no idea. In previous years, both cranes would be there working diligently to shore up a nest. Finally, I arrived the next day with the water level now down substantially. Mom was firmly planted on the nest, incubating her eggs. The muskrat hut in which the goose had made her nest was not as tall as it once was after the beaver flattened the top of it. Some of her eggs were still visible. So the question is, did the crane's eggs survive the breaks in the incubation process? This question led to some very interesting research. I reached out to the International Crane Foundation about this, and their answer was, it all depends. Generally speaking, bird eggs can be left cold for many days before the incubation process begins. This allows birds that lay clutches of eggs to hatch synchronously. In the case of the sandhill cranes, they normally lay only 2 eggs, so incubation begins shortly after they are laid. Both parents incubate the eggs, and they take short breaks occasionally from the nest, but typically they are not off the nest for long. Ducks, geese, and other waterfowl have been known to take long breaks from incubation without harm to the embryos. And, as the embryos mature, their own metabolism can keep them warm. In this particular case, the crane eggs were subjected to cold weather about halfway through their incubation process. It certainly wasn't the best time for this to occur, but from what I've gathered, we really just don't know if the eggs survived. Regardless as to the outcome of this nest, what this Sandhill Crane accomplished over the past few days is simply amazing. She was able to successfully build this nest up during a flood and keep the eggs above water during the process. The nest is a good foot higher than it was before the flood. Now that's amazing. Well, that wraps it up for today. Unfortunately, we just don't have an answer as to whether those eggs are viable, and only time will tell. I'll be sure to put out a new video about this as soon as we get a final answer. Take care, thanks for watching, and stay tuned.